Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Borderland Storytellers. I'm Nick Miller. On this program, we'll hear from two speakers who share their experiences and work preserving the history, language, and culture in our region. Dr. Yolanda Chávez Leyva will discuss the impact the attack on Spanish speakers has had on our borderland communities. Dr. Chávez Leyva is the director of the Institute of Oral History and associate professor in the Department of History at UTEP. She's also been engaged for many years in activist scholarship on a range of issues related to border history and Chicana culture. She blogs at fiercefronteriza.com. Dr. David Romo will discuss how communities in our region join together to work to preserve the historic Duranguito neighborhood in El Paso. Dr. Romo is the author of the book Ringside Seat to a Revolution, an underground cultural history of El Paso and Juarez, 1893 to 1923. He's also a historian and a musician based in El Paso, Texas. His focus is in borderland studies, and he is a former Fulbright scholar. This program is produced by KRWG Public Media in partnership with the NMSU Provost Office, the Center for Latin American and Border Studies, the Beyond Borders Community of Practice, Journalism and Media Studies, and the Creative Media Institute. Welcome to Borderland Storytellers.
I call myself a Fronteriza. That's one of my main identities because I was born in Juarez and raised in El Paso. And since I was a very little kid, I've had an understanding of the border that ended up shaping what I do for a job. And in my work, I always want to talk about both of those things because I think the people on the border are very resilient. The way that the border is talked about in the media or talked about by politicians has no relevance to the reality of how we live on the border. I am someone who loves the border, someone who loves to listen to the stories of the border. And as I get older, I realize how my own story and my own family story fits into the history of the border. Sometimes I'm driving to school and I look across the freeway and I see one of my favorite grocery stores in Juarez. And I think to myself, I'm on my way to work in Texas and I'm looking just right there and it's a whole other nation. I was born in Juarez in the mid-1950s, and I had an identical twin named Elisa. Her mother, my grandmother, took my twin Elisa. My great-aunt Esther took me in. So I came to El Paso. Elisa stayed in Juarez. We were born really prematurely. We weighed 2 pounds each. I got medical care because I came over here to El Paso. Elisa didn't get medical care, and she died. I remember knowing that when I was 3. So when I was a little kid, I would go in the backyard and I would make like a little grave and pretend that it was her so I could be next to her. So I've always felt like part of me is buried in Juarez and part of me is alive here. Like so many young people, when I became a college student, I wanted to leave El Paso. And I did leave El Paso and I moved to Austin to go to UT, but then I came back and then I moved to Tucson to go to the University of Arizona. Then I came back. Then I moved to San Antonio to be a professor at UT San Antonio, and then I came back. So I learned finally on my third coming back that this is where I belong. There's a second grade photo of me. Almond-shaped eyes, short bangs, hair flipped up, very 1960s, and an expression that is neither happy nor sad, And I look at that photo and I think about my childhood. It's the little Yoli, I tell myself. Growing up, I used to look out the front window of the house and see the kids going to school down the block, and I couldn't wait to start school. I couldn't wait to start elementary school. So when it came time for me to start first grade, I was so excited. I couldn't wait to start. One summer day after my father had gotten home from work, my parents, Jerry and Esther, called me over to have a talk. And what they told me was confusing. Mija, they said, ya no puedes hablar español. You can't talk Spanish anymore. In my household, they only spoke Spanish. And by the time I was 3, I was fully bilingual. So this statement, ya no puedes hablar español, was confusing and it was painful. And it was not until I was well on my way to becoming a historian that I understood why they were telling me that. Beginning in the 1910s, school districts across the Southwest dealt with the growing number of Mexican immigrant and Mexican American children by trying to de-Mexicanize them. And they did this through 2 ways. Through the Americanization programs that taught English, civics, that tried to teach Mexican American children how to be good workers, and through the no Spanish policy. The no Spanish policy said the children could not speak Spanish on school grounds, and the tools of this policy were corporal punishment and humiliation. Corporal punishment in that children were spanked, they were punched, they were slapped for speaking Spanish, and humiliation in that children were put into Spanish detention. They were made to write, "I will not speak Spanish." And when my parents crossed the border, these were the policies that were in effect. My father, Jerry, crossed the border in 1914 as a 4-year-old, and my mother, Esther, crossed in 1921 as a 9-year-old. They both attended what were back then called the Mexican schools. Throughout the Southwest, there were schools that were labeled Mexican schools, not because they were in Mexico, but because the student body was comprised of children of Mexican descent. And then there were the American schools, or the white schools. The Mexican schools had less funding, they had inadequate resources, often they didn't even have playgrounds. Sometimes the children only received half a day of schooling, while the American schools had the more experienced teachers, they had the newer books, they had good facilities. And it was in these circumstances that my parents, Jerry and Esther, attended school. My father dropped out in 3rd grade to support his family after his father abandoned them. My mother dropped out in 6th grade after the death of her mother. What I learned as a historian and as someone growing up in my family is that these policies created trauma for them. It shaped their identity. And decades later, it would create trauma for me, and it would shape my identity as well. When I was 3, my pediatrician said, "You can't live here." We lived in South Central El Paso, right by the oil refinery. And I had bad asthma. I had to go to get treatment once a week. So the doctor said, "Move closer to the mountains." So we moved to what was back then northeast El Paso, is now central El Paso. And it was a neighborhood that was slowly transforming. It had been a neighborhood created in 1919. It was mostly white, but little by little Mexican-American families were moving in. And the schools were in the process also of changing. When I started school, my 2 older cousins, Manny and Becky, who attended school on El Paso's south side, were bearing the brunt of the no Spanish policies. And that was why my parents said, "Mija, ya no puedes hablar español," because they wanted to protect me. They didn't want me to be hit. They didn't want me to be humiliated. Now, the ironic thing is that the elementary school that I went to, Rusk Elementary, was still considered an American school. And when I started school, they didn't have the no Spanish policy. In fact, because it was an American school, I was obligated to take Spanish classes during my 6 years there. There was a deeply held belief among educators that white children should speak Spanish because eventually they would be the employers of Mexican workers. The fact that I couldn't speak Spanish created tremendous shame in me. It was a wound. And over time, my mouth could no longer speak the words. I could not shape it to speak Spanish. And over time, I felt more and more like I didn't know who I was. There were times when my mother would speak Spanish to relatives and they would make fun of her. Ay, Esther, tu español. And I could see the shame on her face. As I got a little bit older, 5th or 6th grade, I would try to speak Spanish to them again. And my mother would do that to me. Ay, Yolanda, tu español. And I was never angry. I understood that somehow it was coming from her own pain. I never gave up. In my 20s, I worked as a social worker, and my clients were about half monolingual Spanish speakers. So I forced myself to form those words again. In my 40s, everything started to change. In my 40s, I started to take my students to Mexico City and to indigenous villages in Mexico. And one of the villages was Ocotepec, Morelos. And Ocotepec was, up until the 60s, almost 100% Nahuatl speaking. Nahuatl is an indigenous language that's very common throughout central Mexico. I was sitting on a hill in Ocotepec one day with Doña Filomena Parra, a midwife, a partera, and with an incredible muralist and educator, Marta Ramirez. And we were talking. And we were talking about how the Catholic Church in Ocotepec was telling children that if they spoke Nahuatl, they would go to hell. So we began to talk about this loss of language. And Doña Filomena said, when she was a little girl, Nahuatl speaking, the school teacher washed her mouth out with soap and told her, don't speak that language, that's dirty. And then Marta, who was born in Chihuahua but raised in LA, said when she was a little kid in LA, the same thing happened to her. Her teacher washed her mouth out with soap and said, don't speak Spanish, that's a dirty language. So I knew then that it was not about English over Spanish or Spanish over Nahuatl. It was about power over culture and trying to shape children in a certain way. In 2006, I began to work organizing in El Segundo Barrio and later Barrio Duranguito with Spanish-speaking residents. And again, I was pushing myself to speak Spanish. Well, what did I learn in over 60 years since my parents told me you can't speak Spanish anymore? I learned that self-compassion is one of the most important things that we can have in order to heal our wounds, to heal our traumas. In the 90s, when I first started teaching at the university, and I was the age of my students' parents. Now I'm their grandmother's age, but back then I was their age. And they would come and they would tell me, Professor, I'm so mad because my parents wouldn't teach me Spanish. I'm so mad. I can't believe that they took that from me. And they had anger and disappointment and resentment. And I would tell them, love your parents, have compassion for your parents, because my generation was physically, emotionally, psychologically wounded in order to take Spanish away from us. And they would say, oh, I didn't know that. And they would understand their parents better. Compassion. Compassion for the generations that came before us, that lived through these policies and still retain their language, whether it's Nahuatl in Morelos or Spanish in the United States. Compassion for the generations that sought to protect us in the best way that they knew. Compassion for ourselves as we continue to look for how to reclaim who we were from childhood. On my way here, I was talking to my friend, and I was telling her what I was going to talk about, and she told me about her friend who went to the same elementary school, Rusk Elementary, but 4 years after I was first there. And it turns out that by the time I was in 4th grade, Rusk School had instituted the no Spanish policy. And her friend remembers coming from Chihuahua, speaking Spanish, and the teacher slamming her head on the desk. By the time that Rusk had started the no Spanish policy, I was already not speaking Spanish, except ironically in Spanish class. That trauma has remained so deep that there are times that I feel like I can't get Spanish out, that my mouth cannot speak the language that was my first language, the language that represents my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. And there are times when my Spanish flows. So what I want to say for those of us who are wounded by these school policies is know that it wasn't us, it wasn't our parents, it wasn't our grandparents. It was a system that wanted to make us into something else. Language. Language is more than just words used to describe something. Language incorporates a worldview. I don't remember the days after that conversation of "Mija, ya no puedes hablar español," but what I remember so clearly is that every night I used to pray in Spanish, and it was something that comforted me even as a little kid. And in those days of "ya no puedes hablar español," my prayers went from El Padre Nuestro to the Our Father. Let us please, please love ourselves. Let us please never give up knowing who we are. And always honoring our ancestors for everything that they did for us, knowing that they did the best they could.
I'm a fronterizo. I was actually born in California, but came back at a very early age to the border. I'm an historian, I'm a musician, I'm a community organizer. I'm part of a band called Los Liminals, and we play all kinds of fronterizo fusion, jazz, cumbias, all kinds of stuff. I'm also the author of a book titled Ringside Seat to a Revolution. For a long time growing up, I just thought we were in the middle of nowhere. And now as an adult, I know that, yeah, we're in the middle of nowhere, but we're also in the midst of everything. both sides of that imaginary line called the border. We have such a unique place. Where else are you in the United States are you gonna find all of that within a little 9-acre area like here? Nowhere. I say I can only do what I can do, because sometimes I'm super overwhelmed with everything, you know? So it's always like, I'm doing what I can do. I feel great about the fact that we were able to stop the destruction of Duranguito. It took us a long, long time. There was a group of us that began back in 2006, and right now we're in 2023. I've taken it upon myself to recover those submerged memories, and I think that's part of the healing process. Very few places have the kind of history as El Paso and Juarez. La Frontera is a beautiful, incredibly rich place, but you have to see it. You have to know where to look and how to look. So 2006 was the year that changed my life. It changed the life of my community of El Paso and La Frontera. I had just written a book, Ringside Seat to a Revolution, where I was very much inspired by the places themselves, the buildings of South El Paso. And South El Paso includes Segundo Barrio, Chihuahuita, and Duranguito. I had written this book because there were stories that I had never learned in school. And really the person that most inspired me to write these stories was my great aunt, Adela Dorado. She had come to El Paso when she was a teenager during the Mexican Revolution, around 1913, 1914. And she would tell me all kinds of incredible stories about growing up in northern Mexico and in El Paso. One of the stories that she told me was when she was a teenager, having to cross between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, where she cleaned the American home. She was a maid, and having to put her clothes in a big secadora, like a big dryer. And when people at the bridge, the US Customs agent gave her back her clothing, her shoes had melted. And I remember that little detail of having to cross during the Mexican Revolution through this very humiliating process of fumigations. Just opened up my mind. I wanted to know more and more. So the Segundo Barrio has often been called the other Ellis Island, but in reality, it has so much more significance than just the other Ellis Island. The history of the United States is always told from an east to west perspective. So the first stories are, say, 1620 with the landing of the Pilgrims, or 1607 with Jamestown. But let's look at the origin story of the United States from a south-north perspective. What does that tell us? In terms of, and I'm just talking about European colonization here. I mean, you have some of the first crossings from a south to north perspective as early as, I don't know, 1640, 1681. I'm sorry, 1540, 1598 is a very important one with the crossing of Oñate and the settlers. Where did that happen? Well, it happened right in the southwest corner of Duranguito, on Paisano and Santa Fe Street, if you're from El Paso. So 1598, that's 20 years before the landing of the Pilgrims. When I look back, for a long time, we thought our stories weren't worth anything, right? We were very marginal to what the American story was. South El Paso, Duranguito,
tells a very personal story as well. So when I looked into the stories of my great aunt, I went up to the National Archives in Washington and found some of those stories that my great aunt had told me. I found a photograph of a secadora, a steam dryer, and on the bottom there were shoes, the same shoes that had been returned to her, melted. I found records that there were German scientists that were looking at the El Paso crossing back beginning in the 1920s, because one of the pesticides that was being used was Cyclone B. And I started seeing connections, our stories of what's going on here in the Segundo Barrio, in Duranguito, are stories that have not only local significance, but global significance. My mother lived in the Segundo Barrio. My grandfather lived in the Segundo Barrio. His name was Francisco, or Pancho, and he used to work at what was later known as the Bowie Bakery, a very famous bakery in El Paso. My mother lived in the Segundo Barrio, later moved with my aunt to California. That's where she met my father. My father also migrated. He came here in 1954 in 1954, President Eisenhower had this Operation Wetback, where millions of Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, were deported, quote unquote, back to Mexico. He lived in California, where he met my mother. He worked at the Palo Alto Sanitation Department. So when I graduated from high school in El Paso, I was admitted to Harvard University and Stanford University, and I had to make a decision. And I said, I think I'm gonna go to Stanford because my father was there before me. And he wasn't there as an alumni, he was there as a guy that was collecting the garbage. And that circularity of personal history and also a collective history was very important to me. So I was born in a county hospital in San Jose, California. And this is the first time I tell this story publicly. After I was born, my mother could no longer have any children because for some reason, and I always thought that there were some complications, her tubes were tied. And I remember when I was growing up, my father took the brunt of the blame for that. It's like, why did you put me in a county hospital, she would tell him, why couldn't, you could have paid for a private hospital. But much later as an historian, I realized that at that time, I was born in the 1960s, at that time, there were thousands of women who were forcibly sterilized and had their tubes tied because of the eugenics movement. Between 1909 and 1978, 20,000 women in California were forcibly sterilized. And 60% of them were Mexican American. I'm not sure if my mother was one of those, but just the fact that you're born in a context in which there's greater stories here, underlying stories, the stories of eugenics, global stories. My grandfather told me about my indigenous ancestors. On my mother's side, his mother was Huichol Indian. The Huicholes have been crossing back and forth. The Native Americans of all kinds have been migrating back and forth through what is Duranguito and the Segundo Barrio and other parts. The fort that the Manso Indians, the so-called Manso Indians, taught Oñate, and they showed him where to cross. The migration that goes through the Duranguito goes back and forth. Yet, there isn't a single sign that tells the story of this migration. Most of our history has been erased, literally demolished. Fighting for it wasn't easy. I remember when I first heard about this plan, there was a map And it showed 127 acres of Segundo Barrio that was going to be torn down. And I remember when I saw this map, I was invited to this kind of a special group by this group of developers. It was like somebody took a bat, hit me right in my gut, right? It was an emotional impact. It was just a map, but there were 127 acres. And I knew those spaces. Those spaces were connected to the history, to my family's history, to the history of my community. And it changed my life. I had to fight, but not alone. I remember calling my friend Bruce Berman, who's a professor here at NMSU, and say, Bruce, help me. Let's take photographs of all these places that are going to be eliminated and demolished. I remember calling Denise Chavez, a wonderful supporter of the arts and cultura, and she did. I called her, and she created cultural benefits for us. There were people from here, from Las Cruces, the Unitarian Church, that united in our efforts, because this was a binational movement of developers who wanted to demolish and erase our culture. They did it for economic interest. There was a community in Juarez named Lomas del Poleo, and we formed a 3-state alliance between the people of Chihuahua, the people of southern New Mexico, and the people of El Paso, West Texas. And it was a long, long struggle. It was a very, very long struggle, one that you fight for 20 years. Why do you do it? I mean, why do we fight so hard? Are we just fighting because we're preservationists and we like old stuff? No. It's because when you walk through the streets of Duranguito and the Segundo Barrio, there's stories. That's why we fight. We're connecting to these stories. These stories are very personal. They're family stories. They're stories of who we are as a country, who we are as a world. And there's stories that have been hidden. When you hide stories, the presence is so strong that you could say that there's spirits coming out. You go into some of these places and you can feel the spirits. And I don't necessarily think I believe in spirits in the common way, not the common way. I believe in spirits, and I don't know how I believe in spirits. But those are the spirits of our community, of who we are. They're our spirits. And so when people ask me, why do you dedicate so much time? Why can't you just write some books or play some more music? And that's part of it. I remember Dr. Leyva and me, we met with the residents of Duranguito back in 2016 when they were first told that, or when they first found out that their community was going to be erased. And Dr. Leyva looked at and I looked at each other and said, oh my God, the residents are asking us to help them again. The fight for Segundo Barrio had been so long, it had taken 10 years, and finally we were able to stop its destruction. And we said, how can we do this again? It was so traumatic. There had been actually deaths. People had been killed in Ciudad Juarez fighting for the communities. One of the attorneys was shot down. But we had to do it. We could not do it. And so when, just in the beginning of this year, 2023, the city of El Paso finally voted against destroying Duranguito and building a sports stadium there, to tell you the truth, I couldn't believe it. I wasn't expecting that victory. It was almost like a miracle. I mean, this was a David and Goliath struggle. We had allies. One of the reasons that we were able to stop legally this destruction was because of the ghost of our ancestors, the Mezcaleros. There was an Apache peace settlement in Duranguito, and we were able to force the city to do an archaeological excavation And they refused to do it, and it went all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court. They dropped the appeal, and now we have a permanent injunction, a legal injunction, against the demolition of Duranguito. So Duranguito is a space. It's a small 9-acre portion of one of the oldest neighborhoods in El Paso, in this part of the world, a neighborhood that tells the story of our origins, of who we are, of who I am, of who my family is, of who my broader community is, like the people that are here today, of who this country is. But this country doesn't know who it is. And I think it's important for us to remember.
And welcome back to Borderland Storytellers. Dr. Chávez Leyva, Dr. Romo, thanks very much for the stories that you told today. These are stories of American history that are very important, but most of the people in the rest of the country don't know anything about them. They're becoming more and more important because of the rapid pace of change in this country. And we hope that this show can help people understand that. We do have a studio audience, and they're here to ask some questions, and we do have our first studio audience member at the microphone to ask questions. So if you would introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Nick. I'm Greg Smith. I'm a former city councilor here in Las Cruces, former president of the Las Cruces Arts and Cultural District Coordinating Council. So the success of the Duranguito project, those kinds of things are very inspiring to us here in Las Cruces. So with urban renewal having done such a number on our downtown. But we do have some remaining historic structures like the Amador Hotel and others. And so any advice that we can get as far as how to move those things forward and why they're important when people talk about all the other issues that are going on. How does this have cultural impact when you're talking about an area or particular historic structure?
Dr. Romo, I think you're best able to answer that question.
Yes, the first thing is research. I think telling the story in its complexity and really making sure that you get it out is the first step. But you need community power to stop something, because usually these kinds of projects are backed up by very powerful people, downtown political machines, developers, the politicians that go along with this. Our struggle is, you have to realize that, especially if there's a lot of interest in knocking down some of these buildings or erasing this history, you're in for the long run. And oh my God, is it hard to build coalitions? And sometimes we've built coalitions with people we didn't expect to build coalitions with. People that might be in different parts of the political spectrum. And so you have to form alliances, and you have to just be very patient and make sure that you don't get discouraged. There's this cliche, you can't beat City Hall, but I think Duranguito proved that you can beat it. Not too many stories in the United States of, in this case, an entire Mexican-American community literally standing in front of the bulldozers and stopping them. And so that's why we're very proud of Duranguito. And every circumstance is different. But I think in every circumstance, you just have to be very patient and know that you're gonna go through a lot of ups and downs. So a lot of self-care at the individual level, and make sure you have a lot of community support. It's not easy because it's hard to get the word out. Usually the media is not on your side. So yeah, it's patience, dedication, perseverance.
It's kind of a cliche, but it's people power.
Absolutely.
Basically is what it is, because they have to come up against some very powerful interests. Okay, we do have another question from the studio audience, so if you would introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Vicente Enriquez. I'm a public school teacher here in the El Paso area. I actually was a former student of Dr. Leyva, and Mr. David Romo was an advisor for me, I believe, I remember. But what I would like to ask is, due to how the media has use the borderland and using their politics and everything. I always thought, well, what would be the better way of, bringing more representation here? What is one way of, that whole talk of making more states for our country? So maybe splitting up from the state of Texas and making a whole new state, because our interests are so different from over there and we're so far away. So what's your take on that?
Dr. Leyva, do you want to try that one?
For over 140 years, the borderlands have been a lightning rod of controversy, and we see it in the political rhetoric today. The borders are always portrayed in the most negative of lights by both sides, both countries. I think one thing that we could do is to highlight border voices more, to talk about the reality of living on the border. People have to speak up more. We have to find ways to actually get those stories out. The border is a very difficult place. It's a very painful place, but it's also a very beautiful place, and it's a very resilient place. So if we could counter the political rhetoric with the reality of who we are on the border, I think that would go a long way in changing people's perceptions, little by little. I think it would be a very long process.
Is that story getting out more, you think?
I think little by little it is. One of the things that I've experienced in the past few years is journalists, filmmakers, artists from the border producing this incredible amount of work, talking about what it is to be on the border, but also people from other parts of the United States and other parts of the world coming to the border and really getting who we are, and that we're not the horrible people that we're portrayed to be.
Yeah. And we have another question. Sir, go ahead and ask.
Thank you very much. My name is Christopher Brown. I'm a faculty member in the Geography and Environmental Studies Department. I worked with Bruce and the KRWG crew to do this. David and Yolanda, thank you for coming. 70 years ago, the Archdiocese of El Paso sold the cathedral to a bank, who tore it down in downtown Las Cruces and destroyed the Mesquite Historic District. 60 years later, those people in El Paso did it again. I have an impossible question and a possible question. The impossible question is, why don't we learn from these tragedies? And the possible question is, how can we better get people to appreciate the rich history that those people are trying to destroy? Thank you.
Dr. Romo?
The history of the border is repetitive, or perhaps it's not even repetitive. There's a whole school of thought. There was the French historians during the 1940s that talked about long-term history, that sometimes history moves at geological paces, right? We think that there's an event and all of a sudden we see progress. And the truth of the matter is that the history of the border, this history of displacement, of deliberate neglect, redlining of new neighborhoods, of destroying incredibly important cultural, spiritual places, religious places in El Paso. And here in Las Cruces, you had I-10, you had the downtowns being destroyed by urban renewal. And it just seems like, yes, we don't learn from history. How do we stop it? I think what we're doing here is so important, the storytelling. And we had a big pachanga to celebrate our victory. And right now we know that the forces that have tried to destroy us in the past are still going to do it. Mm-hmm. The next step for Duranguito is to try to repair not only the buildings that were deliberately torn down, because there were about 5 buildings that were partially destroyed by the developers in the midst of our struggle, but how do you repair the community itself? How do you heal? How do you restore? How do you reimagine? That's a hard one. And the words of hope that I offered is that their side has the bulldozers, they have the developers, they have the riot police, because in one case, we actually did have to stand up in front of riot police. They have the politicians in their pockets. What do we have? We have the musicians, we have the poets, we have the curanderas, we have the abuelas, we have the artistas, we have the storytellers.
Right.
And therefore, we will win. That's my hope. That's the real power.
And we have another question from the audience. Ma'am?
Yes, hi, I'm Linda Rochella, and new to the New Mexico community. So I especially wanted to thank Dr. Leyva because I came to a realization as she was telling her story about not speaking Spanish. I grew up in Detroit, and as a very young child, my grandmother and my great-grandmother spoke Polish extensively to me. And my father came home, I must have been 4 or 5 at the time. My father came home early, heard that, and just went into a fury. My child is not going to learn Polish. My child is going to be an American. And I never really understood until listening to the story today. My father went to a Catholic school in downtown Detroit, and I would not at all be surprised if he was humiliated and punished for speaking Polish in that classroom setting. My point being that my father turned that into the next generation so that the school district did not need to do that to us.
And
we did it to ourselves.
Your question,
I'd like to hear about the comments that the speakers might have had about telling their stories and the effects that it has had on some of the people that have responded to those stories.
I think your story is so important because it didn't just happen here in the Southwest. It happened all over the United States, and as I said in my talk, in other countries as well. I think once we know those stories and know what the generations before us experienced, it does help us to understand, but it helps us to heal. And I'm a great believer in healing that historic trauma.
And our next question?
Hi, I'm Cassie Holguin Bentenaro. I'm an El Paso poet, and my question is for Yolanda. I too have a loss of language for reasons I don't fully understand, and it's a deep wound in me that I'm trying to heal, but there is a lot of anger, and I want to ask Yolanda, how do you get past that anger and forgive?
Okay.
I think we have to think about who our anger is towards. As I said, my students used to be very angry at their parents, but I would tell them, be angry at the system that created this situation. So one way that I got over my anger at the system was by looking for ways to change it, by sharing history, by loving that students in school districts now have access to bilingual education. You know, things have changed. Things are more open, and how can we support that positive change?
And our next question, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry. Hi, my name's Liz. I am president of NAMI Southern New Mexico here, a mental health organization, also with KRWG. But yeah, my question's for Yolanda. Just short comment. I am a white passing Hispanic from El Paso, and my mom didn't teach us Spanish because she was glad we were white passing and we would be able to pass as white. So my question is, why does it matter? Why fight? Preface for that, I recently read an article that said there's a small town in New Mexico called Cuesta, and they have a unique dialect that is not spoken anywhere else in the world. It's been spoken there for 400 years, and it may be fading away. So why fight? Why try to preserve that?
The question of preserving language is so important. Every time we lose a language, and there are languages going extinct all the time, every time we lose a language, we lose a whole library of knowledge, a whole library of understanding of the world. So if we can preserve languages, including the one in Cuesta, then we're preserving a whole world view. And it's important because we need diversity in the world.
Dr. Romo, you want to answer that too?
Erasure. We're always being erased, our language, our culture, our buildings, our history. Right now, there's a whole movement in the United States to make us forget our histories, our collective histories. They want to reimpose a kind of an old school book version, a very monolithic, like I said, an East-West notion of who we are as a people. And that includes obliterating the languages. I myself personally have studied Rarámuri, Nahuatl, also Huichol or Wixárika, because there's certain parts, even in asking a question like, what is your name? In Nahuatl, it's Kentimoteca. Where were you planted? That simple question, where were you planted?
It means something
in
different.
terms of what is your name. It opens up a whole new world. And we have to, memory right now is our greatest form of resistance. The memory of our languages, of our culture, and our history.
Dr. Leyva, you're part of an oral history project. Tell us about that and how it is meeting what we're talking about here to save our cultures.
I have the honor to direct the Institute of Oral History at UTEP, and we gather the stories of Borderlands people. We've been doing it since 1972. We have about 2,000 interviews, and we're focusing right now on two groups. One are former braceros who came here to the U.S. between 1942 and 64. These are men in their 90s now, and they're still alive and they want to tell their story. And the other group that we've been interviewing are asylum seekers on the border from all parts of the world, because we, as Dr. Romo said, know that this is an area that people go through, and we want to document those stories as well.
Okay. We have one more question, and we've only got a minute left, so if you could get right to it, please.
Absolutely. The question is, how do you motivate the community to stand up for themselves? We had good samples, thank God, at Duranguito in Segundo Barrio, and we saw the resilience and contribution of older women, older adults. Could you kindly please address that?
Quickly, please.
We have to, as educators, we have to provide a microphone to the residents themselves, to the people that are most affected. It's time that these stories are not told from the top down, but from the bottom up.
Okay. Dr. Leyva, Dr. Romo, we thank you very much for what you have contributed to us today. We thank the studio audience. We thank you for joining us for this program. We would like to give a special thanks to Dr. Christopher Brown and Bruce Berman and our speakers, Dr. Yolanda Chávez Leyva and Dr. David Romo, as well as our partners who have worked to collaborate with us on this project. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Miller.